Okay, thank you for joining me again in our study of Masechet Yuma. We're going to take up Daf Tet Amud Aleph today, 9a, and we're going to start about 8 lines from the top of the page. But just before we do that, we'll do a brief review of what we learned last week. The whole story started, of course, with the Mishnah, which gave us the mitzvah of a Kohen Gadol being separated 7 days before Yom Kippurim each year. And there was a discussion as to what the Torah source was for that period of isolation, 7 days before Yom Kippur. And the information we got from the Mishnah was that the Kohen Gadol was, during this period of separation, he was sequestered in a little room of the Azara of the Beis HaMikdash, which was the Lishkas Parahedrin. And the Gemara last week, as we made our progress through the Mishnah, started to discuss the origin of the terminology Lishkas Parahedrin, and that that particular chamber had a different name at one time, and it was changed to that of Parahedrin. It was originally a chamber of noble people in the Beis HaMikdash Azara, and later on it was rather cynically given the title of Lishkas Parahedrin, because Parahedrin, or the meaning of the word Parahedrin, is the place where the appointed civil servants sit, which is really a debased term for the Kohen Gadol. And that's because during the Zman of Bais Sheni, there was corruption amongst the leadership, and it essentially led to the Kahuna Gadola being on sale to those for the highest bidder. And it was a position of great status. And very often a Kohen Gadol was only in place for a year or less than a year, as the Gemara now will calculate for us as well, for less than a year before his position was taken by someone else. Either he was pushed out of place by somebody else who was offering more money, or he might have died a death because he was totally inappropriate to the role of being Kohen Gadol. And therefore he met his end when he carried out the Avodah service. For whatever reason, he was in and out all the time, and therefore the name of the chamber, which accommodated the Kohen Gadol, was given this rather low-life term of the Lishkas Parahedrin, someone who's in and out as a civil servant, if you like, appointed at the will of the current governor for whatever reasons and motivations he might have. The Gemara later on wanted to find another situation where Parahedrin was mentioned in Shas, which is quite an interesting. Where else do we see this terminology? And during the discussion and the location of that other place in Shas, we had to go through a whole halachic discussion about the trumas and maasros and tithes, and I'll just share the screen. We're not going to go through this again, don't worry. I went through discussing all the various tithes that are given and taken by a crop farmer normally. And the Mishnah Midot, in which the terminology of Parahedrin was used, it was discussing the situation where bakers buy their flour from collections of small farmers, land farmers, who provide the wheat and sell it to the bakers, and whether the religious status of those providing farmers isn't really known. So there's a real risk that they may not have withdrawn all the tithes that they should have done before passing it on to the bakers. Now, normally, if you buy material or produce, certainly in ancient times, from a source who you could not necessarily validate as having taken all the tithes, then when you bought it, you would have to take those tithes yourself out of doubt so that they were separated. And sometimes that might mean they were separated twice, but it was out of caution and out of doubt. However, the Chachamim were very kind and generous to the bakers and only required them to take one particular type of tithe and not all the other ones that might have not been taken by the farmer. And the Gemara asks, why was this the case? Why were Chazal, so to speak, prepared to be so lenient to these nachtomin, these bakers? And the answer that was given was that the Chazal felt sorry for the profession of bakery, if you like, in those times, because the people in charge of the bakers, and perhaps in charge generally of commerce, were these parahedrim. This is where the terminology came in. They were the quickly appointed officials of the local governor, maybe, and as soon as they came into authority, they would press very hard the bakers who were providing bread to the public to reduce their prices, perhaps in order to carry favor with the population. In so doing, the baking industry had the lowest margins, Nebuch, not like the banks in Israel. Their margins were so low that they couldn't even make a living. Recognizing that, Chazal decided not to impose on them some of the cautionary retithing that they would normally impose on ordinary citizens. But the bakers were, for various reasons of heterim that were found, they were very lenient to them. Otherwise, essentially, they would not have been able to make a living, and they would have been out of business, and we'd have had no bread. Angel's Bakery would have closed down due to lack of margin. And the whole reason we brought all this is because it says the parahedrin were responsible for forcing the prices down, and they were these guys who were coming in and out, and each time a new parahedrin official came in, he wanted to show off his credentials again to the public and would whack the bakers on the head. So being a baker at the time was not a fine profession. Okay, so they're the only, if you like, relevance of that particular limud we did last week was in order to again meet up with the terminology of parahedrin. So what we've seen as we begin our Gemara for today is that there were periods of history when there was corruption, when there were difficulties with the local officials and governments, etc. And the Gemara is now going to take us into a very interesting piece of Agadah, part of which is really almost the most famous Agadah anywhere in Shas, certainly when you are learning prior to the 3 weeks, the 9 days, the discussions about the causes of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the reasons for the exile. And of course, we have 2 Botei Mikdash that were destroyed, the first Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash. And as we'll see in a moment, there was also the destruction of the Mishkan in Shiloh. That's actually the first Beis HaMikdash to be destroyed. We'll have a look at that in a moment. And the whole context of this piece of lengthy Agadah now is that it, so to speak, winds up nicely the discussion about the corruption in the second Beis HaMikdash times, with these Kohanim Gedolim coming in and out as they bought their way into power. So we're going to take up the Gemara now, and I think it's 8 lines down from the top of Daf Tet Amud Aleph 9a, and it's 3 words from the end of the line. Omar Rabba Bar, those are the last 3 words on that line. So we'll start the Gemara. Omar Rabba Bar Chana, Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Just as a side note over here, there are very, very many Agadot in the whole of Shas, across all the Masechtas that come in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is one of the most frequent, so to speak, contributors to the Gemara. I mean, at the time, he wasn't aware he was contributing to the Gemara. He was just the leading scholar in Eretz Yisrael at the time, at his time, in the 3rd century, 2nd, 3rd century, and he was active in Tiberia, and he was reckoned to be, if you like, the leader of Talmud Yerushalmi in Eretz Yisrael at the time, and he was always responsible for Agadot, stories of the past, Midrashim, etc. A large number of his Agadot are told by his student Rabba Bar Chana. So this is a very, very frequent combination of names. Omar Rabba Bar, he was the son of the son of Chana, so it would seem. Omar Rabbi Yochanan, he said this in the name of his teacher Rabbi Yochanan. My Dirsiv, what is the meaning of the following verse? There are going to be quite a lot of verses we'll be bringing in, which will provide the scope for drashot. My Dirsiv, what is the meaning of the following pasuk, which we'll quote from Mishlei, from Proverbs. It's a fairly simple posuk this time. Most of the pasukim we find are very complex. This is a simple one from Mishlei. Yiras Hashem tosif yomim. The fear of Hashem will increase your days. Your longevity will be increased if you are Yirei Hashem. Ushanos Rishon tiktzorna. But the years of evil people who do not have Yiras Hashem, who do not have fear of Hashem, tiktzorna, they will be cut short, like katsira, like cutting the harvest, katsar, short. So in other words, if you want arichas yomim, in a sense, Yiras Hashem is a promoter. It's a good medicine for arichas yomim. A Rasha, it will be tiktzorn. And of course, you can read this posuk symbolically, metaphorically. You don't have to read it medically and biologically if you don't want to. But the Gemara will do so in the following brisa, in the following statement Rabbi Yochanan brings. He's now going to explain this verse. Well, I translated it for you, but he's going to explain it historically. So he says, Yiras Hashem tosif yomim. The first part that says fear of Hashem will bring about an increase in days, increased longevity in a person who is a Yirei Hashem. Zeh Mikdash Rishon. This is referring to Bayis Rishon, the time, the epoch of the first Beis HaMikdash. That's Tosif Yomim. That's giving us extra days. What does that mean? And it refers here to we will see, the tenure of the Kohanim Gedolim. That's how we're going to look at the posuk now. The tenure of the Kohanim Gedolim during the first Beis HaMikdash was Tosif Yomim. It included length of days. How do we know that? And he goes on to say, Sha'amat Arba Meos Ve'esa Shalim. We briefly mentioned this last week as well. The first Beis HaMikdash stood for 410 years. Veloshim Shubo Ela Shmona Osa Kohanim Gedolim. And yet, during this long period of 410 years, there were only 18 Kohanim Gedolim through that full period, which is an average of over 20 years tenure for each Kohen Gadol. Each Kohen Gadol had Arichas Yomim. Arichas Yomim in the job, it means here. We don't know what the Arichas Yomim was in terms of their lifespan, but in terms of the function, as a Kohen Gadol, only 18 took up that total 410 years. By the way, we will see in a moment that Bayis Sheni is 420. How do you remember the number of years? 410 for Bayis Rishon. There's a very simple mnemonic for that. The word Bereshis, which has lots of plays on words. But if you want to, you look at the base, means Bayis. Reish Aleph Shin is Rishon. Yud Sof, Tov Yud, 410. Bayis Rishon 410. So that takes this, makes this number very easy to remember. That's just a little quip. It's not, I'm sure that's not the reason the first word in the Torah is Bereshis, but it does help you. It is a useful mnemonic. And there were only 18 Kohanim Gedolim, and let's just go on. Ushanos Rishoim Tiktzorna. What about the end of the posuk, which says that the tenure of Rishon will be very short, cut short? Zeh Mikdash Sheni. That's the tenure during the second Beis HaMikdash. Sha'amad Arba Meos Ve'esrim Shana, which was in place for 10 years longer, 420 years. V'shimshu bo Yosem Ishlosh Meos Kohanim. And more than 300 Kohanim Gedolim were in place during those 410 years. The Gemara is not going to prove this for us, but if you remember, we said that means, and we're going to say a number of them were there for a long time, which means the average Kohen Gadol was hardly in place before he lost his position. Let's just go on a bit further and see how the Rabbi Yochanan proves it. He says, well, and there were more than 300 Kohanim Gedolim in 420 years. Amongst those Kohanim Gedolim in Bayis Sheni, Arboim Shana Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was a Kohen Gadol amongst those 420 years for 40 years. He had a long tenure. He was a great tzaddik. Remember, we say Shimon Akadmi Shiare Anshe Knesset Hagadola. He was one of the last of the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, very early on, and famous Shimon HaTzadik. This was the the cusp of time between the Persian leadership, if you like, Memshalah in Eretz Yisrael, and the Greek. Shimon HaTzadik, midrashically, is meant to have met up with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was on his way, one of his conquering episodes. He was going through Eretz Yisrael, and he was perhaps going to attack Yerushalayim. And then Shimon HaTzadik met him outside Yerushalayim, and he looked angelic. And what happens is Alexander the Great gets off his horse and he prostrates himself before Shimon HaTzadik. And his people want to know, what's going on? Are you prostrating yourself over a small, little band leader in Palestine? What's going on? So he says that I've had a dream all my life and all my battles of this individual with a white beard and white cape, and it looks just like this man. This is the man of my dreams. So he paid respect to Shimon HaTzadik, and Shimon HaTzadik therefore was able to dissuade him from attacking Yerushalayim. So eventually, of course, the Greeks did take hold of Eretz Yisrael, but they didn't, at that time, they were not machariv the Beis HaMikdash as a result of that meeting. So this is at the towards the beginning of Bais Sheni. So a 40-year tenure to Shimon HaTzadik. Ushmonim sheshimish Yochanan Kohen Gadol. 80 years tradition, this is. For 80 years, Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Yochanan was the Kohen Gadol. We don't really know which Yochanan this really is. Some say this is towards the beginning of the Hasmonean period. It's not clear, because there were quite a few Yochanans who were reputed to be in Kohanim Gedolim during Bais Sheni. What the Gemara says, which is interesting about Yochanan Kohen Gadol, which is supposed to be a limud for everyone, is that he was Kohen Gadol. He was a blessed and valued and respected and genuine Kohen Gadol for 80 years, and then suddenly went off the derech and became a Tzeduki. He became a Sadducee. So they say, you learn from here, Al tan minas atzmacha ad yom moscha. Don't believe in yourself until the day you die. And since you don't know when you're going to die, never believe in yourself. In other words, never believe that you're incorruptible. A person, no matter how long they've been on a certain derech, you can't say, he's on that. And it could be both ways. A person could be on the wrong derech and be turned around instantaneously. A person could be on the right derech and somehow make a complete change to their life, which is unanticipated. So this is Yochanan Kohen Gadol. The Eser Sheshimesh Yishmael ben Fobi, and 10 years that Yishmael ben Fobi was the Kohen Gadol. Again, we don't know much about Yishmael ben Fobi. For Omri Law, and others say also, Achas Esrei, 11 years, all within the second Beis HaMikdash period, Sheshimish Rabbi Elazar ben Charsam, that Rabbi Elazar ben Charsam served as the Kohanim Gedolim. Now, these mentioned names are people who were in place for a long time during Bais Sheni, which means when you subtract all that, which is what the Gemara is going to do, says Rabbi Yochanan, Mikan ve'elech, if you work out from this, Seva Chashuv, go and do your calculation, Shokol echad ve'echad lo hotzi shnoso. All those other than these four mentioned names here, you subtract the 80 and the 40, etc., and you work out that the other 299, or almost 300, probably served for much less than 1 year each. And that's the reason that we brought this piece. So in the first temple period, during a pious period of Kohanim Gedolim, there were very few serving in a long period. And in the Bais Sheni, because of the corruption that we mentioned already, the Kohanim Gedolim were in and out very, very quickly. Just out of interest, again, the final name we have over here, Rabbi Elazar ben Charsam, who's mentioned here as being the Kohen Gadol who served for 11 years, as the Gemara says about him, that Rabbi Elazar ben Charsam is a person who is an example to everyone who's wealthy, very wealthy, and has not devoted enough time to Torah and mitzvahs. for them not to make the excuse, well, I was so busy looking after my assets. Look, I'm the head of a big mutual health fund or whatever it is. I have 45 nursing homes. I haven't got more than an hour a day to spend on Torah, and once every 4 weeks I can learn with my child, etc. What do you expect? But I'm giving a lot to tzedakah, but don't expect me to find the time because my assets take up all the time. Marba, Marba Dagos, etc. I'm so full of worry for my assets, I've got no time. So this Rabbi Elazar ben Charson was fantastically wealthy, and yet he made enough time for himself to become a Talmud Chacham and also a Kohen Gadol, it would seem, from here as well. So there's no excuse for anyone, no matter how wealthy they are, to pretend that it hasn't given them the available slots to be involved in Avodas HaKodesh. That's the lesson from Rabbi Elazar ben Charson. In any case, this is Rabbi Yochanan's statement about the periods in the Beis HaMikdash. The first Beis HaMikdash period, pious, and the 18 Kohanim Gedolim. And the second, it seems, gone today, here today, gone tomorrow. Now, what is interesting, actually, is that first statement of the 18 Kohanim Gedolim during Bais Rishon. We had Lo Shimshu Bo Elo Shemona Asa Kohanim Gedolim. It's a huge amount written about this now, because where does this come from? Where are these 18? Look, we'll never know the 300 from Bais Sheni. There's too many there, and we don't know all their names. But we've got Tanakh, haven't we? Tanakh teaches us about the Bais Rishon period. So we do have a source for various Kohanim Gedolim. How is that reckoned out? So I'm going to share with you one of the sources, which is very problematic, as we'll see in a moment, from which the 18 may or may not be derivable. So let me share screen. Second. One. Again, Divrei Hayomim. If you remember a few weeks ago when we were looking through the 24 Mishmarot Kahuna, the 24 watches of Kahuna, where they came from different towns, that was all within Divrei Hayomim. We actually had the names and where they came from, which was a wondrous thing. Divrei Hayomim, this wonderful storage of information, it's biographical information, lots of lists. You don't get many lists anywhere else. So here we have what appears to be a time period of the Kohanim Gedolim in Divrei Hayomim, but it's very problematic. Let's just take a quick look at it. I've headlined this to say they may simply be descendants of Aaron, not all of them Kohanim Gedolim. But in any case, there are others we know who are Kohanim Gedolim who are missing. So what's going on? But this is the list. If you want to look, just let's start at the top. We won't go all the way through. It says, Ubenei Amram, Aaron, Moshe, Miriam. Ubenei Aaron, we're into Kahuna, Nadav Avihu, Elazar V'Isama. Very good. We know they are. Elazar holid as Pinchas, Pinchas holid as Yeshua, etc. Now, I've highlighted by boldness over here from a certain time onwards. If you read this line I highlighted, it says, V'Yochanan holid as Azariah, Hu asher kihen b'bayis asher bona Shlomo Yerushalayim. He's the first Kohen Gadol of Bais Rishon, because that's the Bais that Shlomo built in Yerushalayim, which means that all those appearing earlier on the list may well have been Kohanim Gedolim prior to Bais Rishon, which means presumably in the Mishkan. There was a Mishkan in Gilgal and in Shiloh. Mishkan in Shiloh was there for hundreds of years, so it could be that these are earlier on. Problem is, if you look through all here, to this list, you won't find Eli. Eli was the Kohen Gadol, is missing. He's the most famous one, and he's not there at all. So if this is prior to Bais Rishon, Eli, who was the Kohen Gadol in Shiloh, should certainly be in this list. He isn't. Why isn't he? Because some say that it's wrong to assume that all these were Kohanim Gedolim. If you look at the headline here, where does it say they were all Kohanim Gedolim? It says, B'nai Amram Aaron Moshe, B'nai Aaron Nadav Avihu, Elazar V'Isama, and then it says Elazar, holid as Pinchas. So this seems to be the lineage of Elazar. But there was another son, Itamar. And it seems that it could be that Eli was descended from Itamar and not from Elazar. And that would explain why It could be that certain Kohanim Gedolim are missing from this list, that this is a list of descendants of one line of Aaron, that of Elazar, and doesn't include everyone. So that already makes this not a complete list of Kohanim Gedolim. The reason I'm bringing it to you is because the Rishonim try hard to make this list the source of the 18, which it may not be after all at all, as we've seen. Anyway, if there were 18, how are you going to count 18? I've got a problem. If I'm starting from Bais Rishon, then count the number of highlighted names I've shown you here. Azariah is the first one. He's the first one in Bais Rishon, at Shlomo's Bais. And then there is Amariah, Achituv, Sodok, Shilom, Chilkiah, Azariah again, Soroyah, and Yehud Sodok. There's 9. You can count them for yourself. So where does 18 come from? Well, one answer, and there's a Tosfos over here that grapples with this greatly, as do others. So Tosfos brings the Rivah. Rivah was one of the Bali Tosfos, famous Bali Tosfos, who had a version of this Gemara that said there were 8 during Bais Rishon, not 18. Shmoneh, not Shmonasa. But hang on a moment. I mean, 8 is nearer 9, but we've got 9 here. You could say, well, that's an improvement, because if there is such a version in Talmud, which may be the correct version, 8, and there's 9, we're almost there. So the Rivah says further, I can show you we're absolutely there. This is 8. You know why? This very last character, Yehud Sodok, is stated to have been the Kohen Gadol during the time of the distraction itself, and he was taken into Galut Bovel. He was actually one of the captives who was taken to Bovel, which means he did not finish his term as a Kohen Gadol, not because he died, but because he was kidnapped, if you like. He was taken captive. So the Rivah suggests that his name isn't included because he was not, if you like, all the way through a Kohen Gadol. And 9 minus 1 makes 8. So Bob, your uncle, we've now been able to justify 8 rather than 18, which is one way of getting to the answer. Tosfos himself actually brings another answer. He says, it's all very well, but Tosfos says, but we've looked through a lot of versions. Where does the Rivah get his 8 from? I can't find other places where it says 8. It says 18. If you like, the Bali Tosfos also, they went around the libraries of the Louvre and the Bodleian, and they couldn't find any others that said 8. They say 18. So he says it's all very well solving the problem by making 18 into 8 and taking the 9th one away and saying it doesn't count. But I insist that the list should be 18 long. And how do I make it 18 long? So what he does, this is all, you've got to cheat in order to try and get the answer. It depends how you're going to cheat in a sense. The Rivah actually has a version and he's tried to justify it. Tosfos gives you another possible solution, which keeps 18 as the number. What's his version? So he says, I'm going to keep all of these 9. I'm not going to take away Yehud Sodok because he was Nigla, that he went to Bovel. No, there's 9. So how does 9 become 18? Listen to this. So Tosfos says, I believe that every time there was a Kohen Gadol, there was always a Sagan Kohen Gadol, a deputy Kohen Gadol. You see the terminology Sgan Kohen Gadol, the function of the Sgan, appearing many times, a very official function in the Beis HaMikdash. He was in charge of a heck of a lot of things and deputized for the Kohen Gadol. But he's not cheating greatly, Tosfos. I'm trying to read Tosfos in small print over here, because he actually mentions the Sof Melochim. He says at back of Sefer Melochim, it once mentions a Kohen Gadol and mentions the name of his Sagan. So it seems that the Sagan is sometimes also named. So says Tosfos, therefore, it gives me room to think that the Sagan Kohen Gadol is also considered to be a Kohen Gadol in this numbering of 18 here. So you've got 9 who are the Kohenim Gadol, and you've got another 9 who were the Sagan. Interestingly enough, one of the commentators who's done a lot of work on trying to work out these Kohenim Gadolim, I'm not sure why, but he spent a lot of time, he said that it's possible that the role of Kohen Gadol was split officially between two individuals, whether you call it Cohen Gadol and Sgan Cohen Gadol, or Cohen Gadol type A or type B, doesn't make any difference. And you know, we have something very similar. You have, of course, at the time of the Zugos, and later on as well, in time of the Tanom of the Mishnah, you had the Nossi and the Av Beis Din. The Nossi was, if you like, the political representative of the Jewish people, and he was also a sage, usually a sage as well, but someone who was close to the governor in Judea and other places as well, and he dealt with the needs of the Jewish people. He was usually from a wealthy and prestigious family, and may have been descended from the line of Hillel and David HaMelech. That was the Nossi. The Av Beis Din was the most senior religious figure, and they were side by side with almost equal authority. The Nossi had more of a titular secular authority. The Av Beis Din had the official religious authority, if you like. It was more like the chief rabbi and the president. But the chief rabbi at the time had a powerful political position as well. So they were side by side. And you can imagine that the Kahuna Gedola might also have been split, with a Kohen Gadol who is doing most of the legwork in the Beis HaMikdash, if you like, the practicing ritual Kohen Gadol. And then you had a Kohen Gadol who was more of a man of the people somehow, and perhaps had more connections with the local authorities, with the governors, etc., and tried to maybe to fundraise for the Beis HaMikdash and stuff like that as well. And he would occasionally do the avodah himself. He was not a person who had no ritual position and no capacity, but he wasn't the one usually doing it. Now, if you take all that, you can multiply 9 by 2 and you get 18. Okay, so that's an interesting aside here, just to try and solve this little conundrum of how 9 becomes 18. As you see, there are different views on how you can solve this particular question. Now we're going to go on with the Gemara, which is going to take us really into the meat of the corruptions and the outcome in terms of the destruction of the temple. In other words, the consequences for a corrupt leadership and a corrupt population. This is material for Tisha B'Av. I'm afraid we're a few days late, but nevertheless, it's always worth learning when everyone learns it. So we're on Omer Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa, which is, let's just where we are in the Gemara. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom of your Omid on 9a. Omer Yochanan ben Terosa, Mipnei ma charavo Shiloh. We're going to go through the 3 destructions. We're going to go through the cause of the destruction of Shiloh, the sanctuary, which was a precedent for the Beis HaMikdash, and then we're going to go through the destruction of Bais Rishon and then Bais Sheni. Now, just to go back again into history, when the Bnei Israel came into Eretz Yisrael with Yehoshua, of course they had an Oron and they had various Kalim, which were part of the Mishkan that they carried with them from the Midbar. When they first entered into Eretz Yisrael, they built a Mishkan in Gilgal, which was very near, if you like, to the place of entry over the River Jordan. And they were there for only 14 years. And after that period, the Mishkan moved to Shiloh. And it was there for 369 years. You can go to Tel Shiloh today and see the borders of the Chotzer or the Beis HaMikdash there. There are lots of interesting findings. That was the Bais Rishon. That's really Bais Rishon. And it was there for almost as long as Bais Rishon and Bais Sheni, 369 years, not a short period at all, during which there would have obviously been multiple Kohanim Gedolim, perhaps some of those names that we saw in Divrei Hayomim, and others as well from the line of Itamar, like Eli. Until its destruction. And its destruction was during the time of Eli HaKohen. And there's a whole terrible story there about the Philistines and how they came in, they destroyed Shiloh. And when Eli's 2 sons were killed, and Eli, so to speak, dropped dead out of sadness and shock when he heard the news. A terrible period that the Sefer Shmuel brings. So this was the period of Shiloh, and during Shiloh, the Mishkan was operating on a small scale, and it was destroyed. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa is going to tell us why, for what sin was Shiloh destroyed? Why? Really, if it should have had a happy ending. Shiloh was Shiloh, and then eventually the Aaron and everything should have been taken without any destruction to the bayis that David and Shlomo built, but it wasn't. First of all, it was captured, the whole of Shiloh was destroyed, people were massacred. Why did all this happen? This was Chorban number 1.1. We'll see why in a moment, but I'm going to take you on another little tangent, because we have here the name of an individual who's very rarely appears in Shas. He appears in Medrash, and he's got a very strange name, Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa. Rabbi Yochanan, the son of an ox. Now, literally, a Torah is an ox. So Terosa was the son of an ox. Why was he called Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa? So I'll share my screen with you. We'll do a little colorful detour. Okay, just 1 second. So Rashi brings this, and others bring this. It's from a medrash. This is a beautiful medrash, and it's worth reading. As I say over here, it's the son of an ox. I'm going to take you through this medrash. We'll translate it as we go along. I've had to put full stops in. When I found it had no full stops anywhere as well, which makes it even more confusing. Okay, Omer Rabbi Seinu. Our rabbis once said, Ma sahayu b'Yisrael, what's happened? Echad shahaylo pora achas chereshes. There was a man, a Jewish man, who had a plowing ox. Pora here means really an ox, one that is used as a beast to carry the plow through the field. Nismata yodo umochralo legoy echad. One day he became poor, and he wasn't able to sustain the ox anymore, and he had to raise capital. So he had to sell, poor man, he had to sell his only last ox. And he received a nice sum for it. Kivin shelakocha hagoy, as soon as the goy bought it from him, at a non-Jewish buyer, v'chorsha ima sheishes yomim shel chol, and during the first 6 working days, he worked nicely with the ox. It was a good ox, he was very pleased with it. B'Shabbos hotzia shetacharosh imo, on the Shabbos, which was the 7th day, he took out the ox and he strapped it to its harness, etc., for it to start its work of drawing the plow. V'robsolo tachas ha'ol, refused to get up from the ground with a Shabbosdika ox. Hoyaholech umaka osa, v'hi eino zozom in coma. He bashed it, but it refused to get up and do any plowing. Given Shirah came, since he saw that this was the case, halach, he went for Amal Osa Yisrael. He took the ox, or maybe he didn't take the ox, but he came back to the Jew who sold it to him and complained. Shemarchalo, and he said, Bo, tul parasacha, go and take your ox back or do something about it. It's useless. Shemetzah yeshba, maybe it's in pain. You give me a sick ox. Shahari kamarani makeosav hienozozim koma. I hit it and refuses to get up and start to do some playing with me. So what happens? Osa Yisrael Havin. That Yisrael realized what was going on. Loma, and he said, Bishvil, and he said to himself, Bishvil shal Shabbos, because you took it out on a Shabbos. And it was always accustomed to rest on a Shabbos. The Torah says your ox has to rest on a Shabbos. And he knows Shabbos, it's Shabbos. It had a calendar in its head and knew it was Shabbos. Amalei. So he said, the Jew said, I will come with me. I will get the ox to come and work for you. I will remedy the situation. Kivin Shabbat, when he arrived, for Amallah Ozna, so he spoke quietly into the ear of the ox, and he said, Para, para, ox, ox, at your dat, you remember, Keshahayis Birshusi, Hoisa Chareshes Yumei Hachol, and Bishabas Hois Ninuach. that you would only plow for me during the week, but on Shabbos you had a day off. But Aksha Shagarmu Avono Sai, that now that my sins have reached the situation that I haven't been able to hold on to you anymore. In other words, I recognize that whatever reason I've become a pauper, HaKadosh Baruch Hu min Hashemayim knows why that is. Ve'es berishus at b'shus goy. And now you belong to a non-Jew. Bevakasha mimech imdi v'charshi. Please, I beg you, get up and get back to work. You belong to a goy now. You don't have to keep Shabbos anymore. Umiyad omda v'charsha. From then on, it got up and it would do its plowing. So the goy was mystified by this magical reawakening of the ox on the Shabbos. Amalei osa hagoy. That goy said to the Jew, Ani mevakeshcha tul poroscha ad achshav ani bo mesav achrecha shtei bo mamid alachas. I wanted you just to get it up somehow, maybe, I don't know, by pulling it on the neck and giving it a good beating. But you seem to have been able to persuade this ox. And now he says, I'm not going to let you go until you, Mr. Jew, tell me, what did you whisper in its ear that persuaded it to get up? After all, I wearied myself. As much as I smashed it on the head, it never got up. So Hischil also Yisrael Mephaisei. So the Jew started to explain to him and to appease him. But Omelon, he said, don't believe that I practice any sorcery. In other words, the guy wanted to know, what is the magic spell? Is it abracadabra and three? What is it? What is it you say into the ox's ear that converts it to being able to follow your will? Lo kishuf, it's not sorcery. V'lok shofim, and it's not magic or sisi. I just whispered a few sweet nothings in its ear for onda v'chorsha, and it got up and it started working. So what happened? It was very effective for the goy. Miyad nisyar hagoy Omar. Immediately, the goy was so impressed and so startled and concerned. And it said, listen to this, Uma impora, if already an ox she'ein la lo sicha, that cannot carry out conversation, v'lo das, and it doesn't really have its own mind, hikira es bora'ah, it recognized its creator. What does that mean? It didn't want to work on the Shabbos, or it recognized its owner, the Jew. See what instinctive sense this ox had, which is supposed to have no sense at all. For ani sheyitzrani yotzri b'demuso, becoming very religious. This is funny, goy. That my Creator has made me in His image, the nosam b'das, and has given me das. Eini holecho makir esbori. Should I not be able to go and recognize my Creator? Am I more stupid than this ox? Miyad bov in this gayer. He immediately went and became a Jew, this guy, the lomad, the zocha l'Torah, and became zocha to become a Talmud chacham, v'hoyu korim shemo Yochanan ben Terasa. And they called him Yochanan, the son of an ox, to acknowledge the fact that he became this Gayer as a result of this experience with his ox. And even until today, Rabboseinu Omrim, our rabbis sometimes say Halacha Mishmo. They will sometimes say Halacha in his name. Indeed, this Gemara we learn over here of Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Terasa is one of these Gemaras quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the son of an ox. Now the Gemara says a very cute ending over here. Ve'im tomer ata she'al yedei para nizkarev adam echad lekadvei shechina. If you will say, how is it possible that a non-Jew should become converted because of some experience with an ox? How can a person go closer to God because he's met a very fancy ox that happens to do something? You'll dismiss it and say it's completely impossible. Says the Gemara, of course it's not impossible. Hare, after all, we should know that this should be possible. Hare al yedei para, He taharason shel kol Yisrael, memasha karu be'inyan zos chukas haTorah. What's so unlikely about this? Does not a Parah Aduma, is not a Parah Aduma the agency of purification for Jews in Israel? When a person is Tomei Mace, you sprinkle upon him the ashes of a Parah Aduma. We don't say, it's just a Parah. We recognize there may be something special about a Parah. So therefore, this Parah, which can bring about, a Parah can bring about the sanctification of the Jewish people, certainly can bring about the conversion of a Goy into a Jew. And this particular beautiful story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa. So let's go back again to the text. So we're going back again. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa, he said the following: Mipnei ma chorba Shiloh. What was the reason that Shiloh was destroyed? What was the sin of the people? So the Gemara brings now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Terosa brings, Mipnei shehoyo bo shnei devarim. Because at the end, there were two things that led to the downfall of Mishkan Shiloh. Gilui Aroyas or Bizayon Kadoshim. Very interesting combination over here. Gilui Aroyas, which means immoral behavior, obviously, of one type or another. Ubizoyon Kadoshim, Kodshim, and treating Kodshim, Karbonos, holy animals that were brought for Karbonos disrespectedly, in a way which is inappropriate for the status of Kodshim. And the story will now unfold. What is it we're talking about? Gilu Aroyas. How do we know there was Gilu Aroyas? And what we will see now is that we're not talking necessarily about the whole period. Unfortunately, we're going to see that the downfall was due to the two sons of Eli. Now we know from Sefer Shmuel that there were unworthy children to Eli HaKohen. Again, a terrible lesson, that Eli HaKohen, one of the most holy of all people, he was so holy and he had two sons working with him in Shiloh, you'd have thought would follow his derech, but no, they were exploitative. And we'll see in a moment, though, that there's some discussion as to whether the sins and exploits that are mentioned in the Sefer Shmuel are to be taken literally or not. But even if they're taken non-literally, there's certainly a level of disgrace in the way in which they conducted themselves. And they conduct themselves in a disgraceful way, both as far as Gilui Aroyas and Bizyon Kadoshim. And as a result, Mishkan Shiloh would eventually be destroyed. Maybe it means it typified the sort of behavior at that age, rather than saying it was exclusively a misbehavior on these two individuals. But in any case, it's put in the context of the two sons of Eli. Now we're going to quote the Psukim, and we'll see what they say inside. So it says in Shmuel Aleph, in discussing the story of Shiloh, it says, the Eli Zokein mode, I'm carrying on in the Gemara over here, which is quoting the Psukim. One second. The Eli Zokein mode, Eli was already getting very old. The Shama, and he heard, as Kol Asher Ya'asun Bonov L'chol Yisrael. It reached his ears what others were saying about the bad conduct of his own sons and what he was doing amongst they were doing amongst the population. What were they doing? Ve'es asher yishkavun es hanoshim hatzova os pesach ohel moed. That they were taking to bed, if you literally means lying with, the women who would come outside the Pesach Ohel Moed. You can imagine the women were coming, as we'll see, as Gemara proceeds to explain, to bring various korbanos, because they were yolados, they'd born children, and they had to bring their doves or whatever. They came for whatever reason. When they would come to the Mishkan, before, if you like, Eli's sons would accept the korbanos they would require certain favors from these women. Essentially, it would seem, if you take the passage literally, that they were committing adultery with the women who had come to the Beis Hamikdash, which is about the worst form of violation possible, because this is the Beis Hamikdash as well. We're not even talking about a back alley somewhere. We're talking about people who came to the Beis Hamikdash. So it's a really terrible. It's an insult, certainly, to his two sons. Now, the Gemara goes on to say, though, even though Achazal have said, and this is a Gemara in Shabbos, Kol ha'omer b'nei Eli chot'u einu elov toeh. Even though Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said, anyone who takes this pasuk literally to say that the sons of Eli had physical relations with these women who were coming with their korbanos, this is a big error, that this is intended to be a magnification of a much smaller misbehavior of them, which, because they were the sons of Eli, if you like, the Tanakh has blown up to something much bigger. That's what Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani says. You cannot contemplate the sons of Eli really doing what they've said to have done. What did they do? And here you turn over to Talmud base 9b. Sheshihu eskinehim. They delayed the nests of doves. What did that mean? When a Yoledis used to come to bring her dove as a korban, they used to bring after their childbearing. And until the dove was brought and was offered on the Mizbeach, the women would not have a complete tahara and wouldn't be able to return to their husbands. That was the last part of purification. Apart from mikvah, they needed to bring the shahus kanehim after giving birth. So the korbanos should be immediately accepted by the Kohanim operating the Beis Hamikdash, so that the husbands can return, the women can return to their husbands and be together with them again. However, they withheld these deliberately for a long time. They couldn't be bothered, they were negligent, they thought it was funny. In so doing, this is according to the light interpretation of Shmuel bar Nachmani, they were interfering with the marital relations of the women with their husbands who were waiting with them back home. And it's as if they'd had a relationship with these women. For people of the stature of Eli's sons, a small misdemeanor is considered to be like the grotesque large misdemeanor. And it's referred to Yishkavu as Hanoshim. But lav dafka, it doesn't really mean yishkavu. That's the way Shmuel bar Nachmani understands it. But nevertheless, this was for them, it was of the magnitude of Gilui Aroyas. Strange, really. But if that, according to Shmuel bar Nachmani, that's considered like Gilui Aroyas, and therefore would have been one of those sins for which Mishkan Shiloh would have been destroyed. The Gemara is now going to explain the second one, which was Bizoin Kodshim, which is the disgrace to the Kodshim, to Korbanos. So we'll see that in a moment. Just a word to say that in the Gemara and Shabbos, this is a classic place where Rav Shmuel Nachmani goes through a number of the major averos that we find in Tanakh. And there is a machlokus there as to whether they should be taken literally or whether the Tanakh blows them up because it just wishes to emphasize how great people can be punished for very small misdemeanors as if they had committed the major misdemeanor. This is one of those cases, the Bnei Eli. You have Shmuel bar Nachmani becoming protective of the Bnei Eli. So no, they didn't really do what Nach tells you they did. The other major one that we know of is with David HaMelech and Bathsheba, the famous Avera that he put to bed Bathsheba. And so according to Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, he says exactly the same. Anyone who says that David HaMelech really had relationship with Bathsheba, Eino in a Torah. He didn't do that at all. He just saw something, and to him, because he was a great person, etc., etc., it's treated as if he had had a relationship with someone he shouldn't have a relationship, but he never really had it. So there's this actually sums up two schools of thought on how you learn Tanakh, even today to some extent. There's the school of thought, the Gemara has a machlokes on this. Shmuel bar Nachmani is only one opinion. According to another opinion, Bnei Eli did exactly what Tanakh said they did. If you find that surprising, find it surprising, but it's a fact. David HaMelech did exactly what he was said to have done. As I say, there are two lines of thought. One that looks through Tanakh and tries as far as possible to defend the great characters in the Bible, because they are biblical characters, and we shouldn't look at them askance in any way as if we are as good as them. And then there's another side that says, no, you have to say what happened, happened. Now, if you will ask, therefore, how is it possible for David HaMelech, the great David HaMelech, and Tanakh says about him that he went in the ways of Hashem. He was a very, very great leader. We don't find him falling in any other way, almost no other way. He wanted to build the Beis HaMikdash, very noble character. And we believe, why should the Bnei Eli, brought up in the Beis HaMikdash, be such poor, such people of such ill repute? Where does this come from? So the school that says you should take it literally would quote the fact that the Gemara says, and we've seen this as well, that the greater a person is, the harder they can fall. That kol gadol mechavero yitzro gadol hemenu. That anyone who's greater than somebody else, his yetzer hara grows with a person's nobility. The more noble a person is, the more the yetzer hara has to grow in order to constitute a challenge. HaKadosh Baruch creates a certain parity in each individual. We all should labor to reach a higher standard. Now, if immediately you say, well, I'm such a standard, I've got no yetzer hara anymore, well, what's the standard? In fact, you could say about a person who's reached that level, big deal. Well, he's not a noble person anymore. He's got no more Yetzer. Here I am, a poor little person fighting my Yetzer. David HaMelech has got no Yetzer because you say he's such a great person. It's not true. So according to the literalist school, you can see the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And we've, of course, seen this as well in our own lifetimes and in daily experience when we read the newspapers, people you couldn't believe who are then accused of things you can't believe. And the only answer is, this was said 2,000 years ago, was recognized well in Talmudic times as well. Okay, let me just quickly go on to the second thing. So it just goes on. Because Bnei Eli, even according to the apologetic school, they didn't really do exactly what they said. The fact that they held back the korbanos and they prevented the women from coming back to be able to be with their husbands again, as if they had bedded those women themselves. And the second thing was bizoyon kadoshim. That's the second thing for which Shiloh was destroyed, because Dichsiv, and here we quote another pasuk which is a bit technical, Gam beterin yaktirun is achelev, uvonar hakohen v'omar, even before the chelev, part of the fats which need to be offered up for a korban on the Mizbeach, need to be burnt. Even before that was done, Ubonar HaKohen, the sons of Eli, would instruct their servants to say, to say to the person who was bringing the korban, give us our meat already. We're waiting for our meat. We want to make sure that we get this meat really fresh. Strange this appears in Shmuel, and the man would say to them, he would say to the person bringing, and he was the one bringing, he says, no, first you have to offer up the fats, and only then are you allowed to eat of the meat of the korban. What are you doing, Mr. Cohen, wanting to eat even before the procedure's over? For Amalo, but yet the Kohen would say, the Bnei Eli would say, we haven't got patience. Ki ata titain. We give it to us right now. We're not going to wait until we put all the fats on the mizbeach. Ve'im lo, and if you won't give it to us, lokakti v'choska, we'll knock you on the head and take the meat ourselves. V'atihi chatas hana'arim gedola ma'od. And as a result of this as well, an inappropriate procedure with a korbanos, that was considered a great sin. es Panei Hashem. Ki ni'atzuha noshim ninchas Hashem. This is a quote, after all, from Shmuel. They had essentially disgraced the offering of Hashem. If you look at it this way, what was happening is that the Mizbeach is where the fats should be burnt up. Essentially, if you look at it, it's an avodah la Hashem. Only when you've done that avodah la Hashem is the Kohen free to take those parts of the animal to which he is entitled as a Kohen and to eat it himself. In other words, first you have to serve Hashem, and then you can serve yourself. Over here, we had the Bnei Eli wanting it the other way round. First serve us, then we put the fats on the Mizbeach. So that was Bizion Kedoshim. So the Gemara is saying, or rather Rabbi Yochanan Terosa in his first stage over here, when he talks about the destruction of Mishkan Shiloh, is saying it was this behavior, these behaviors that brought about the destruction of Shiloh. And if you think about it, if Shiloh is a place which is supposed to be a place of where it's an avodah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that if this is the way the Kohanim are practicing, what's the point? What's the point of Shiloh? So Shiloh was destroyed as a result of these inappropriate practices of Bnei Eli. Whether you take them literally, or even if you don't take them literally, given their positions, they shouldn't have been involved in these sorts of behaviors. Next week, I'm not going to be, in fact, for the next 3 weeks, I'm not giving shir. This is time for anyone who wants to go away, because I know you wouldn't want to leave while I'm still giving shir. So the next 3 Mondays I'll be missing, but I'll try and make sure everyone knows when we rejoin again. So thank you for joining me today. Let me just cease recording.